On December 28, 1992, 23-year-old Stephen Clark walked into a public toilet in Saltburn-by-the-Sea, England. His mother waited outside for him. He never came out. For nearly 3 decades, his disappearance remained a complete mystery. No body, no witnesses, no answers. His father spent years making public appeals, begging for information, crying on television about his missing son. Then in September 2020, police made a decision that shocked the world. They arrested Stephen's elderly parents, now in their 80s, on suspicion of his murder. This is the true story of Stephen Clark's disappearance. It's a case that asks disturbing questions about family, truth, and whether the people we trust most can be the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And I warn you, by the end of this investigation, you'll question everything you think you know about this case. This case is one of the UK's most controversial and perplexing missing persons investigations. It's a story where the evidence points in multiple directions, where families are torn apart by accusations, and where the truth seems to shift depending on who's telling the story. Stephen Clark's disappearance has divided investigators, split a community, and raised uncomfortable questions about what really happens behind closed doors in seemingly normal families. Before we dive in, I want to be clear. This case remains officially unsolved. No one has been convicted of any crime. Stephen's parents maintained their innocence until their deaths, and they deserve that acknowledgement. But the facts of this case are deeply troubling, and we're going to examine every detail. If you have any information about Stephen Clark's disappearance, please contact Cleveland Police in the UK. Now, let's go back to 1969, to the birth of a boy who would one day vanish without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that haunts everyone who hears it. Stephen Paul Clark was born on September 3, 1969, in Saltburn-by-the-Sea, a small coastal town in North Yorkshire, England. Marski is one of those quintessentially British seaside communities, quiet, close-knit, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and strangers stand out. Stephen came into the world facing challenges from day one. He was born with physical disabilities that would affect him throughout his life. Medical records indicate he had issues with his mobility and coordination. He walked with a distinctive gait. People who knew Stephen could recognize him from a distance just by the way he moved. Sometimes he used a walking stick to help with balance. But despite these physical challenges, those who knew Stephen described him as remarkably positive. His primary school teachers remembered him as a friendly boy who tried hard in his studies. He wasn't the top student, but he wasn't at the bottom either. He was just a regular kid doing his best with the cards he'd been dealt. Stephen attended Bydale's comprehensive school in Marski. During his school years, he developed friendships with other local kids. He wasn't the most popular student, but he wasn't isolated either. He had his small circle, the kids who accepted him for who he was. One thing that stands out in account from Stephen's childhood is his love of routine. He liked knowing what was coming next. He enjoyed familiar places and familiar faces. Change made him anxious, something that's not uncommon for people who've dealt with physical limitations from a young age. The world can feel uncertain when your body doesn't always cooperate, so having predictable routines provided comfort. By his late teens and early 20s, Stephen had settled into adult life as much as his circumstances allowed. He lived at home with his parents, Charles and Doris Clark. This wasn't unusual. Many young adults with disabilities continue living with family, especially in the early 1990s when support services weren't as developed as they are today. Stephen did have some level of independence, though. He could go for walks on his own. He knew the local area well. Every street, every shop, every path. Marski and the neighboring town of Saltburn were his territory. He'd walk to the corner shop, buy a newspaper or sweets, chat with shopkeepers who knew him. He'd walk along the seafront, watching the waves, breathing the salt air. People in the community were protective of Stephen in that subtle British way, not overtly looking after him, but keeping an eye out, making sure he was okay. If someone saw Stephen struggling or looking lost, they'd check in. That's how small towns work. Stephen had routines that anchored his weeks. He'd watch certain television programs. He never missed them. He'd go on specific walks at specific times. He'd visit specific places. This predictability was comforting to him, and it was comforting to his parents too. They always knew roughly where Stephen was and what he was doing. But here's something important. Stephen wasn't a child. He was 23 years old in 1992. He was a young man with his own thoughts, his own feelings, his own desires for independence. Living at home with your parents at 23, especially with physical disabilities, can create complicated dynamics. Did Stephen resent his limitations? Did he wish for more freedom? Did he feel trapped? We don't know the answers to these questions because Stephen never had the chance to tell us. But they're important to consider as we examine what happened. By December 1992, Stephen's life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Days blurred together in that way they do when you're not working, not in school, just existing. Wake up, breakfast, maybe a walk, lunch, television, dinner, more television, bed. Repeat. It wasn't an exciting life. It wasn't the life a 23-year-old might dream of. But was Stephen's life, and by all accounts, he'd made peace with it. And then came December 28th, 1992, a day that would change everything. To understand what might have happened to Stephen, we need to understand his family, particularly his parents, Charles and Doris Clark. Charles Clark, Stephen's father, was born in the 1930s. He'd served in the Royal Air Force, which in British culture carries a certain respect. RAF servicemen are seen as disciplined, duty-bound, patriotic. Charles embodied that image. He was a man of routine, structure, and control. After his RAF service, Charles worked various jobs, but was known in the community as a reliable, if somewhat stern man. Neighbors would later describe him as someone who kept to himself, who maintained his property meticulously, who didn't engage in gossip or frivolous conversation. But there was another side to Charles that some people noticed. He could be brusque, short-tempered when things didn't go his way. Some neighbors recalled him snapping at local kids who played too close to his house. Others remembered him having little patience for disorder or unpredictability. How did this personality mesh with raising a son who required constant care, whose physical limitations meant unpredictability was part of daily life? Doris Clark, Stephen's mother, was quieter than Charles. Where Charles might voice his opinions loudly, Doris tended to fade into the background. Neighbors described her as a nice enough woman, but somewhat overwhelmed. She was Stephen's primary caregiver, the one who helped him with daily tasks, who monitored his medications, who managed his appointments. Being a full-time caregiver is exhausting. It's emotionally draining, physically demanding, and mentally taxing. And Doris had been doing it for 23 years back in 1992. 23 years of constant care, constant worry, constant responsibility. Did Doris resent this role? Did she ever wish for a different life? Again, we can't know for sure, but these are normal human feelings. Caregiver burnout is real and well documented. It doesn't make someone evil to feel overwhelmed. It makes them human. But what happens when someone reaches their breaking point? The Clark household, from outside appearances, seemed normal enough. The family lived in a modest terraced house on a quiet street in Marski. The house was well maintained. No peeling paint, no overgrown garden. Everything in its place, just as Charles preferred. Inside, the home was reportedly neat and organized. Charles insisted on order. Meals were at specific times. Routines were followed. This structure probably helped Stephen. He thrived on routine, but it also suggests a household where deviation from the norm wasn't tolerated. Some neighbors later recall that the Clarks seemed to keep Stephen somewhat isolated. He'd go on walks, yes, but rarely did they see him interacting with other young people his age. He didn't have friends over. He didn't seem to have hobbies beyond his walks and television. Was this isolation protective? Parents worried about their vulnerable son being taken advantage of? Or was it controlling? Parents who wanted to manage every aspect of their son's life? The truth might be somewhere in between, or it might be darker than we want to imagine. One detail that emerged years later: Stephen's medication. Like many people with physical disabilities, Stephen took regular medication to manage his condition and prevent complications. His prescriptions needed to be filled monthly. Here's what's troubling. In the weeks before Stephen disappeared, his medication wasn't being refilled regularly. Why not? Was it an oversight? Was money tight? Or was there another reason Stephen wasn't getting the medication he needed? The family's financial situation in 1992 is somewhat murky. Charles had a pension from his RAF service, but it wasn't generous. Doris didn't work outside the home. Caring for Stephen was her full-time job. Stephen himself received disability benefits, but these weren't substantial. Money was tight. Bills had to be paid. Food had to be bought. And Stephen's care, while mostly covered by the NHS, still had associated costs. Did financial pressure play a role in what happened? Some investigators think so. There's also the question of Charles and Doris's relationship with each other. By 1992, they'd been married for decades. They'd spent those decades united in caring for Stephen, but did they resent each other? Did Charles blame Doris for not managing better? Did Doris feel unsupported by Charles? In cases where parents are suspected of harming their child, it's often not just one parent acting alone. It's two people who've reached a mutual breaking point, who've convinced each other that what they're about to do is necessary or justified. This is speculation, of course, but it's important speculation when trying to understand what might have happened. The Clarks also had extended family, siblings, cousins, nieces, and nephews, but Stephen didn't seem particularly close to any of them. The family network existed, but it wasn't tight-knit. Stephen's world was small: his parents, his house, his neighborhood walks. When someone's world is that small, their disappearance creates a vacuum that's hard to fill with answers. December 1992 in Saltburn-by-the-Sea was cold, gray, and wet, typical British winter weather. Christmas had just passed, and the nation was in that odd limbo between Christmas and New Year, when nobody quite knows what day it is and everything feels suspended. Let's look at the days leading up to Stephen's disappearance, because understanding the context is crucial. December 25th, Christmas Day. The Clarks celebrated Christmas at home. It was a quiet affair, just Charles, Doris, and Stephen. There were no extended family visits, no big gatherings. Neighbors later said they saw lights on in the Clark house, but didn't see or hear much activity. What was Christmas like for Stephen that year? Did he receive gifts? Did the family exchange presents? We don't know. But by all accounts, it was an unremarkable Christmas. No arguments, no incidents, nothing that stood out. December 26th, Boxing Day. Boxing Day in Britain is traditionally a day for leftovers, television, and recovering from Christmas excess. The Clarks spent it much like Christmas, quietly at home. The weather was dreary, so there were no walks to the seafront. Stephen watched television most of the day. Charles did some work around the house. Doris prepared meals. A normal day. December 27th, Sunday. By Sunday, the weather had turned particularly nasty. Rain, wind, cold temperatures. Not the kind of day anyone wants to be outside. Stephen stayed indoors. He was getting restless. He liked his walks, and several days inside was making him antsy. Doris later told police that Stephen had mentioned wanting to go to Saltburn the next day, if the weather improved, to get some fresh air and stretch his legs. This is important. Doris's story about Stephen's disappearance includes him asking to go to Saltburn. Was this true, or was this detail added later to make the story more believable? The evening of December 27th. The Clarks went to bed that night with plans to go to Saltburn the following afternoon if Stephen was still interested and if the weather permitted. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed wrong. Or did it? This is where we hit our first major question. What was Stephen's state of mind in the days before he disappeared? Doris would later tell police that Stephen seemed normal, happy, looking forward to getting out of the house. But others have wondered, was Stephen actually happy? Or was he frustrated, depressed, or anxious about something. We have no diary entries from Stephen, no letters, no social media posts. This was 1992. No internet, no mobile phones. We have only his parents' account of his mental state, and if they were involved in his disappearance, their account would naturally be designed to make everything seem normal. December 28th morning. Monday morning dawned cold, but clearer than the previous days. The rain had stopped, though the sky remained overcast. It was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to need a coat, but not unbearably so. Doris made breakfast. Stephen ate, likely cereal and tea, the standard British breakfast. Charles was pottering around the house, as he did. Around mid-morning, according to Doris, Stephen mentioned he still wanted to go to Saltburn. Doris agreed. The plan was to walk there together in the afternoon, let Stephen stretch his legs along the seafront, and then head home before it got dark. Charles would stay home. He wasn't interested in a walk in the cold. But here's a crucial question. Did this conversation actually happen? Or was this entire narrative constructed after the fact? Let's continue with Doris's version of events, but keep that question in mind. December 28th, early afternoon. After lunch, Doris and Stephen prepared to leave for Saltburn. Stephen put on his coat, his shoes. Doris did the same. Charles remained at home, planning to watch television or do some work around the house. They left the house sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m., exact timing would later become a point of contention. The walk from their home in Marski to Saltburn seafront is approximately 2 miles, taking 40 to 50 minutes on foot for someone walking at Stephen's pace. The route would have taken them through residential streets, past familiar shops and houses, eventually leading to Saltburn's Victorian seafront with its pier and promenade. Did anyone see them walking? This is crucial, and the answer is frustratingly unclear. Some neighbors later said they might have seen Doris and someone walking that afternoon, but memories are unreliable, especially when police don't ask questions until days later. No security cameras captured them. In 1992, CCTV wasn't as common as today, and residential areas rarely had cameras. So we have Doris's word that they left together, walked to Saltburn together, and arrived at the seafront together. But what if they never left together? What if Stephen never made it out of the house that day? This is the nightmare scenario investigators would later consider. According to Doris Clark, she and Stephen arrived at Saltburn's seafront around 3 to 3:30 p.m. on December 28, 1992. Saltburn-by-the-Sea is a charming Victorian town with a pier, cliff railway, and sweeping beach. In summer, it's popular with tourists. In December, it's nearly deserted, just a few locals walking dogs, maybe a handful of people getting fresh air. Doris said she and Stephen walked along the promenade for a while. The sea would have been rough. Winter storms in the North Sea create dramatic waves that crash against the shore. The air would have been cold and salty. After walking for 10 or 15 minutes, Stephen told Doris he needed to use the toilet. The public conveniences were nearby, a small brick building typical of British seaside towns. Basic facilities, men's side, women's side, nothing fancy. Doris said she waited outside while Stephen went in. This was normal. Stephen was 23. He didn't need his mother accompanying him to the bathroom. Now, here's where Doris's account gets detailed. And that's important because too much detail can sometimes be a sign of a rehearsed story. Doris said she stood near the entrance, waiting. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. She called out, "Stephen, are you okay?" No response. She waited longer, thinking maybe he was unwell, maybe he was taking his time. 20 minutes passed, maybe 25. Now Doris was getting concerned. She looked around and saw a man nearby. She doesn't know who he was, never saw him before or since. She approached him and asked if he could check inside the men's toilets to see if her son was there. The man agreed. He went inside. A minute later, he came out and said nobody was in there. Doris then checked the ladies' toilets herself, thinking maybe Stephen had gone in the wrong door. He wasn't there either. She went back outside and looked around frantically. She walked to the beach. She checked the pier. She walked up and down the promenade calling Stephen's name. He was gone. Now, let's pause and examine this story critically, because it's the only account we have of what happened, and it comes from someone who would later be arrested for Stephen's murder. The problems with Doris's account. Problem number 1. The unidentified man. This mysterious man who checked the toilets. Who was he? Despite extensive appeals and media coverage, this person never came forward. Police spent years trying to identify him. They never did. There are 3 possibilities. 1. The man existed, but never realized his check of the toilets was important to a missing person case. 2. The man existed, but has reasons not to come forward. 3. The man never existed. Doris made him up to add credibility to her story. Which is most likely? Many investigators lean toward option 3. Problem number 2, the timeline. Doris's timeline has inconsistencies. In her first statement to police, she said they arrived at Saltburn around 3 p.m. In later statements, she said it was closer to 3:30 p.m. She said Stephen was in the toilet for 15 to 20 minutes before she got worried. Later, she said it was 20 to 25 minutes. These might seem like minor discrepancies. People get confused about exact times. But in missing person cases, timelines are crucial, and inconsistencies can indicate a fabricated story. Problem number 3. Why didn't she call for help immediately? After realizing Stephen was gone, Doris said she searched the area herself for a while before going home. Why not find a phone box and call the police immediately? Why not alert other people in the area to help search? Doris explained she thought Stephen might have wandered off and would turn up. But Stephen had mobility issues. He couldn't wander far quickly, and he was familiar with the area. He knew his way around. Why would he suddenly wander off without telling his mother? Problem number 4. The journey home. After searching, Doris walked home, the same 2-mile journey back to Marski. That's 40 to 50 minutes of walking. During that time, Stephen could have been anywhere needing help. Why walk home instead of continuing to search or getting help? Doris said she hoped Stephen had somehow gotten home on his own, even though that made no sense. He had no money for a bus. He couldn't walk faster than her. How would he get home? Problem number 5. The delayed report. Doris arrived home, and Stephen wasn't there. Charles was there. She told Charles what happened. And then, they waited. They didn't call police immediately. They waited hours, into the evening, before finally reporting Stephen missing. Why wait? Their explanation was they hoped Stephen would turn up, that maybe he'd gone somewhere else, that maybe there was a simple explanation. But every minute that passed made finding Stephen harder. If he'd had an accident, if he'd fallen and was injured, time was critical. If he'd been taken by someone, time was critical. The delay in reporting raises serious questions. Now, let's consider the alternative scenario. What if Stephen never made it to Saltburn? What if something happened to him before they left the house, or on the way there, or in a completely different location? What if Doris went to Saltburn alone, walked around for a while to establish a timeline, and then came home and created the story about the toilets? This would explain why nobody saw them together in Saltburn, why the mysterious man was never found, why the timeline is inconsistent, why there was a delay in reporting, why Stephen vanished from a public place without anyone seeing him leave. It's a dark theory. It accuses a mother of creating an elaborate lie about her son's disappearance. But it's a theory that fits the evidence better than the official story. And it's a theory that would, 28 years later, lead police to arrest both of Stephen's parents. When Charles and Doris finally reported Stephen missing on the evening of December 28th, Cleveland police responded immediately. A 23-year-old man with physical disabilities missing from a public place was taken seriously. Officers were dispatched to Saltburn that same evening. By the time they arrived, it was dark, around 6:30 or 7 p.m. Winter darkness in northern England comes early, and searching in the dark is challenging. The first night search, December 28th, police with torches searched the public toilets thoroughly. They checked every stall, every corner. They looked for any sign that something had happened there. Blood, torn clothing, signs of a struggle. Nothing. The toilets were clean, ordinary, unremarkable. They searched the immediate area around the toilets, the promenade, the beach access points, the parking areas. They called Stephen's name. They looked under the pier, behind buildings and doorways. Several officers walked the route from the toilets to the main town area, thinking maybe Stephen had gotten confused and wandered into Saltburn proper. They checked bus stops, phone boxes, shop doorways. Nothing. As night deepened, the search had to be scaled back. They'd resume at first light. December 29th, day 2. Tuesday morning brought expanded search efforts. More officers were brought in. Search and rescue volunteers arrived. The search area widened significantly. Police brought in search dogs trained to track missing persons. The dogs were given Stephen's scent from clothing at his home and set to work. The dogs showed interest in the toilet area, then lost the scent. They couldn't track Stephen beyond the public conveniences. This was significant. If Stephen had walked away from the toilets, the dogs should have been able to follow his scent, at least for a distance. The fact that they couldn't suggest it either. 1. Stephen hadn't actually been there. 2. His scent had been washed away by rain. 3. Stephen had gotten into a vehicle immediately after leaving. Divers were called in. Saltburn's coastline is rocky and dangerous. The cliffs are high, and people have fallen from them before. Could Stephen have walked too close to the edge and fallen? Divers searched the waters off the seafront, around the pier, and along the rocky areas. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had gone into the water recently. The beach itself was searched thoroughly. In winter, the beach is largely empty, and tracks in the sand are visible. If Stephen had walked onto the beach, there should have been evidence. There wasn't any. The interview process begins. While searches continued, detectives began the crucial process of interviewing everyone involved. Doris was interviewed multiple times that first week. She recounted her story. The walk to Saltburn, Stephen going into the toilets, the wait, the mysterious man who checked the toilets, the search, the walk home. Detectives took detailed notes. They asked her to repeat the story, looking for inconsistencies. They asked specific questions about timing, about what Stephen was wearing, about his mood that day. Doris's story remained consistent in its broad strokes, but the details shifted slightly with each telling. A common occurrence, but also a potential red flag. Charles was interviewed as well. His alibi was straightforward. He'd been home all afternoon. He hadn't gone to Saltburn. He'd learned about Stephen's disappearance when Doris came home. Police asked Charles about Stephen's state of mind, about family finances, about any problems in the household. Charles insisted everything was fine. Stephen was happy. The family was normal. There were no issues. But was that true? Checking Stephen's background, detectives pulled Stephen's medical records. They discovered the medication issue, prescriptions not being filled regularly in the weeks before his disappearance. When asked about this, Doris said she might have forgotten a few times, but insisted Stephen was getting his medication. Medical professionals later questioned whether missing several doses would have put Stephen's health at risk. The answer was possibly, depending on what the medication was treating. Police checked Stephen's financial records, what little there were. He had a basic bank account that his disability benefits were paid into. The last transaction was a small withdrawal a week before his disappearance. Nothing suspicious. There were no credit cards in his name, no loans, no debts. Stephen's financial footprint was minimal. Searching the Clark home. In early January 1993, with Stephen still missing, police asked permission to search the Clark home. Charles and Doris agreed. According to them, they had nothing to hide. Officers searched the house from top to bottom. They looked in wardrobes, under beds, in the attic and the basement. They checked the garden, looking for any sign of recently disturbed earth. They found nothing suspicious. The house was tidy, organized, normal. Stephen's room was as he'd left it, bed made, clothes in drawers, personal items on shelves. Police took some items for analysis, Stephen's hairbrush for DNA, some clothing, personal effects, but nothing indicated foul play. The witness appeals. Police put out public appeals for information. They released Stephen's photo to local and national media. They asked anyone who'd been in Saltburn on December 28th to come forward. Several people responded saying they'd been in the area that afternoon, but nobody reported seeing Stephen. A few said they might have seen a woman matching Doris's description, but memories were vague, and nobody could definitively say they saw Stephen. This was troubling. Stephen had a distinctive appearance and gait. If he'd been walking along the seafront, someone should have noticed him. The fact that nobody did raised questions. December turns to January, January to February. As weeks passed with no breakthrough, the case began its slow slide toward cold case status. Searches were scaled back. Divers stopped searching the waters. Volunteers returned to their normal lives. Police continued following leads, but leads were drying up. The Clark family held a press conference in late January 1993. Charles, with Doris beside him, made an emotional plea for Stephen's return. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice breaking. "Stephen, if you're out there, if you can hear this, please come home. We love you. We miss you. Whatever's happened, we just want you back. And if anyone knows anything at all, please tell the police. Please help us bring Stephen home." It was a powerful moment. Journalists described Charles as a broken man, a father devastated by his son's disappearance. Doris sat quietly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. But was it genuine, or was it performance? At the time, nobody questioned it. The Clarks were seen as victims, a family destroyed by a terrible mystery. The first-year anniversary. December 1993 marked 1 year since Stephen's disappearance. The family held a memorial service at their local church. Friends, neighbors, and community members attended. Charles gave a speech about hope, about not giving up, about believing Stephen would be found. The local newspaper ran a feature story. 1 year later, the mystery of Stephen Clark. The article reviewed the case, appealed for new information, and portrayed the Clarks as a family living in limbo, unable to move forward without answers. The police investigation, meanwhile, had essentially stalled. There were no new leads. The case was still open, but no active investigation was happening. Stephen Clark had become another statistic, a missing person case that would likely never be solved. From 1994 onward, Stephen Clark's case entered what's known in law enforcement as the cold case phase. The file remained open, but without new evidence or leads, there was little investigators could do. But for Charles and Doris Clark, the public face of their search never stopped. The annual rituals. Every year on December 28th, the anniversary of Stephen's disappearance, the Clarks held a vigil. Sometimes it was at the public toilets in Saltburn, where Stephen was last seen. Sometimes it was at their local church. Sometimes it was a small gathering, sometimes larger. Charles always spoke at these vigils. He'd thank people for coming, for remembering Stephen, for not giving up hope. He'd appeal again for anyone with information to come forward. He'd talk about how much they missed Stephen, how every day without him was agony. Local media always covered these anniversaries, especially the significant ones. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Charles became a familiar face on regional news, the father who never stopped searching. Here's what's so troubling about this in retrospect. If Charles and Doris were responsible for Stephen's disappearance, these annual vigils were elaborate performances. They were public displays of grief that allowed the Clarks to control the narrative, to present themselves as devoted parents, to deflect any potential suspicion. And it worked. For nearly 3 decades, nobody seriously questioned the Clark story. The investigation continues quietly. While public attention faded, detectives periodically reviewed Stephen's case. Cold case units would pull the file, review the evidence, see if any new techniques or technologies might help. In the early 2000s, Advances in forensic analysis meant old evidence could be re-examined. But in Stephen's case, there was no physical evidence to analyze. No body, no crime scene, no DNA to test. Some detectives over the years did have doubts about Doris's story. The timeline issues bothered them. The unidentified witness bothered them. But without evidence, doubts are just doubts. The toll on the community. Stephen's disappearance left a mark on Saltburn-by-the-Sea. Parents became more protective of their children. People looked at the public toilets differently. Some avoided them entirely, creeped out by the association. The mystery spawned local legends and speculation. Some people whispered that Stephen had been abducted by someone who'd been watching him. Others wondered if he'd had a mental health crisis and walked into the sea. Still others thought maybe he'd run away to start a new life. Nobody publicly suggested his parents might be involved. That would have been unthinkable, especially given Charles's very public grief. The decade markers. When Stephen had been missing for 10 years in 2002, the BBC ran a documentary-style news piece about long-term missing persons cases. Stephen's case was featured. Charles was interviewed at length. He talked about living in limbo, about hoping Stephen was alive somewhere, about the torture of not knowing. At 15 years, 2007, another media push. Charles was older now, his hair gray, his face lined with what appeared to be years of worry and grief. He told reporters that he'd never give up, that he'd search until the day he died. At 20 years, 2012, Charles was in his early 80s. Doris was also aging. They were now elderly parents still searching for their adult son, who'd disappeared decades earlier. The story was heartbreaking, or so it seemed. What was really happening behind closed doors? We can only speculate, but if the Clarks were responsible for Stephen's disappearance, what were those years like for them? Did they feel guilty? Did they have moments of wanting to confess? Or had they convinced themselves that what they'd done was necessary, justified, even merciful? Did they argue about it in private? Did Doris want to tell the truth while Charles insisted on maintaining the lie? Or were they united in their deception? These are questions we may never answer, but they're worth considering. The case nobody could crack. By 2015, Stephen Clark had been missing for 23 years. The case was considered one of the most baffling in Cleveland police's history. A young man had seemingly vanished from a public toilet in broad daylight, leaving no trace. Some detectives believed he'd met with an accident, fallen from a cliff, gone into the sea, his body never recovered. Others thought he'd been abducted by an opportunistic predator who happened to be in the area. A few wondered if he'd somehow disappeared voluntarily, though this seemed least likely given his circumstances. Very few, if any, seriously considered that his parents might be responsible. The Clarks had spent decades proving their devotion to finding Stephen. Why would guilty people do that? The answer, as investigators would later theorize, is guilty people do that all the time. Inserting yourself into the investigation, staying visible, appearing cooperative, it's a way to control the narrative and deflect suspicion. Then came 2018. In 2018, Cleveland Police's cold case unit underwent a reorganization. Fresh detectives were assigned to review old cases. Stephen Clark's file was pulled as part of a routine review. This time, something was different. The detectives looking at the case weren't the same ones who'd known the Clarks for years, who'd sat with Charles at press conferences, who'd seen him cry at vigils. These detectives looked at the evidence with completely fresh eyes, and what they saw troubled them deeply. September 30th, 2020, was a day that would change everything about the Stephen Clark case. At approximately 6 a.m., Cleveland police officers arrived at the Clark family home in Marski. They weren't there for a routine interview. They were there to make arrests. Charles Clark, now 81 years old, and Doris Clark, now 80, were arrested on suspicion of murdering their son Stephen. The elderly couple was taken into custody and transported to a police station for questioning. News of the arrest spread quickly through the small community, and then nationally and internationally. The immediate reaction. Neighbors were shocked. Many refused to believe it. The Clarks? The couple who'd spent decades searching for Stephen? Impossible. But police were serious. This wasn't some speculative arrest. They believed they had evidence, or at least enough suspicion based on their reinvestigation, to justify taking this extraordinary step. The interrogations. Charles and Doris were questioned separately for nearly 48 hours. Police can hold suspects for up to 24 hours initially, with possible extensions. What happened in those interview rooms remains largely confidential, but some details have emerged. Detectives confronted Doris with the inconsistencies in her story. They challenged her timeline. They asked about the mysterious witness who was never found. They asked why she waited so long to report Stephen missing. Doris maintained her innocence. She insisted her story was true. She said police were wasting time questioning her when they should be looking for Stephen's real abductor or finding out what accident befell him. Charles was similarly questioned. Detectives asked what he knew about Stephen's disappearance. They asked about his relationship with his son. They asked about the stress of being a caregiver, about financial pressures, about whether there had been moments when the burden became too much. Charles denied everything. He said he'd been home when Stephen disappeared. He knew nothing about what happened. He'd spent 28 years trying to find his son. Why would police accuse him now? The house search. While Charles and Doris were in custody, forensic teams descended on their home. This wasn't like the cursory search in 1993. This was comprehensive, methodical, and utilized modern forensic techniques not available in the 1990s. Forensic officers spent days at the property. They used luminol to check for blood traces that might have been cleaned but leave chemical residue. They examined drains, looking for biological material. They searched the garden extensively, using ground-penetrating radar to look for any disturbances in the soil that might indicate a burial. They removed items from the house for testing: carpets, floorboards, items from the basement and attic. They took apart parts of the house, looking for any hidden evidence. The specifics of what they found have never been fully disclosed, but the fact that arrests followed shortly after this search suggests they found something significant, or at least something that reinforced their suspicions. The media frenzy. The arrests made national headlines in the UK and caught international attention. The story was compelling. Elderly parents arrested for a murder that happened 28 years earlier after spending decades publicly searching for their son. Media outlets reviewed everything about the case. Old footage of Charles at press conferences was replayed. Journalists interviewed neighbors, former investigators, legal experts. Public opinion was divided. Some people believed the police must have good reason for the arrests. Cold case detectives don't arrest elderly people on a whim. There must be new evidence. Others thought the arrests were outrageous. The Clarks had suffered enough, losing their son and spending decades in limbo. Now, in their 80s, they were being accused of his murder? It seemed cruel. True crime communities online exploded with discussion. Amateur sleuths reviewed every detail of the case, debating whether the Clarks were guilty or innocent. After 48 hours, Charles and Doris were released on bail. This meant they were free to go home, but remained under investigation and could be recalled for further questioning. The Crown Prosecution Service would review the evidence and decide whether to charge them. Charles and Doris returned to their home, which was now a crime scene marked by forensic examination. Their quiet life had been shattered. Through their lawyer, they released a statement. Mr. and Mrs. Clark are devastated by these allegations. They have spent 28 years searching for their beloved son, Stephen. They had nothing to do with his disappearance and fully cooperate with police. They hope this matter can be resolved quickly so the real investigation into what happened to Stephen can continue. Weeks passed, then months. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the evidence. The question was, did police have enough to charge Charles and Doris Clark with murder? In murder cases, especially historical ones without a body, the evidential bar is high. Prosecutors need to believe they have a realistic chance of conviction. Suspicions and inconsistent statements aren't enough. They need evidence that proves, beyond reasonable doubt, that a murder occurred and that the defendants committed it. In mid-December 2020, nearly 3 months after the arrests, the Crown Prosecution Service made their decision. There was insufficient evidence to charge Charles and Doris Clark. The investigation would continue, but for now, no charges would be filed. This didn't mean the Clarks were innocent. It meant prosecutors didn't believe they could secure a conviction with the evidence currently available. For the Clarks, it was a partial victory. They wouldn't face trial, but they'd also never be formally exonerated. The suspicion would hang over them for the rest of their lives. The arrests changed everything. Even though no charges were filed, the public narrative shifted. Many people who'd sympathized with the Clarks now viewed them with suspicion. Neighbors who'd known them for decades began questioning everything. Had the Clarks been lying all along? Had Stephen's disappearance been a cover-up for something terrible that happened at home? The annual vigil stopped. Charles and Doris could no longer present themselves as grieving parents searching for their son, not when they'd been arrested on suspicion of killing him. The community of Saltburn and Marski was divided. Some remained loyal to the Clarks, believing the police had gotten it wrong. Others believed the police were right, but lacked the evidence to prove it. And through it all, Stephen Clark remained missing, his case still unsolved, his fate still unknown. So what evidence did police have against Charles and Doris Clark? What made cold case detectives, after reviewing the file in 2018 to 2020, decide that Stephen's parents were responsible for his disappearance? Let's examine every piece of evidence and every reason investigators became suspicious. Evidence point number 1, the inconsistent timeline. When detectives compared Doris's original 1992 statements with her later accounts over the years, they found multiple inconsistencies. The time they left home varied. The time they arrived in Saltburn varied. How long Stephen was in the toilet before she became worried varied. Details about the mysterious man who checked the toilets changed. In isolation, these might be explained by poor memory. But collectively, they suggested someone adjusting a fabricated story over time, trying to make it more believable. Evidence point number 2, the phantom witness. The man Doris claimed checked the men's toilets has never been identified despite multiple police appeals over 28 years, extensive media coverage, social media campaigns in recent years. The statistical probability that this person existed but never came forward is extremely low. The more likely explanation, investigators believe, is that he never existed. Doris invented him to make her story more credible. Why invent a witness? Because saying "I looked in the toilets myself" would raise questions about why she went into the men's room and whether she actually did. Inventing a male witness who checks solves that problem. Evidence point number 3, Stephen's medication. Pharmacy records showed Stephen's prescriptions weren't filled regularly in the 6 to 8 weeks before his disappearance. Medical experts consulted by police said depending on the medication, this could cause serious health complications. Did Stephen become seriously ill because his medication was withheld? Did something happen as a result? An accident, a medical emergency, that the Clarks then tried to cover up? Or was the medication deliberately withheld as part of a plan? Evidence point number 4, no independent sighting. Despite extensive appeals, nobody has ever definitively confirmed seeing Stephen in Saltburn on December 28, 1992. A few people thought they might have seen a woman matching Doris's description, but even that was uncertain. Nobody saw Stephen, despite his distinctive appearance and gait. In a small town on an afternoon in December, if Stephen had been there, someone should have seen him. The absence of any confirmed sightings suggests he never made it to Saltburn. Evidence point number 5, the shopping bags. Wait, you might say, there were no shopping bags in this case. That was Sneha Phillips' case. You're right, but there's something similar, Stephen's personal items. When police searched the Clark home in 1993, They found all of Stephen's personal belongings, his clothes, his toiletries, everything. But they didn't find anything that suggested Stephen had been preparing for a walk that day. More significantly, if Stephen had been in Saltburn and was abducted or had an accident, he would have had things with him, his wallet, even if it just had a few coins. Possibly a handkerchief, items in his pockets. None of these were ever found. Evidence point number 6, the delayed report. The time between when Doris claimed Stephen vanished and when police were called is approximately 3 to 4 hours. In a genuine emergency, most parents would call police immediately. The delay suggests Doris and Charles were hoping Stephen would return, unlikely given his limitations. Discussing what to do, suspicious. Getting their story straight, very suspicious. Evidence point number 7, Charles's behavior. Detectives reviewing the case noted Charles's behavior over the years was oddly controlled. His public displays of emotion at press conferences and vigils seemed performative, hitting the right notes, but lacking genuine spontaneity. Some investigators felt his appeals were more about how he appeared than actually finding Stephen. This is subjective, of course. People grieve differently, but trained detectives develop instincts about genuine versus performed emotion. Evidence point number 8, financial motive. While Stephen was alive, he received disability benefits. When someone goes missing, those benefits continue for a period while the person is searched for. Eventually, if the person is declared dead, life insurance or estate issues come into play. Did financial desperation play a role? Investigators looked into the Clarks' finances in detail during the 2020 investigation. While they haven't publicly disclosed everything they found, the fact they pursued this line of inquiry suggests they saw it as potentially relevant. Evidence point number 9, the caregiver burnout theory. Psychological experts consulted by police noted that 23 years of being primary caregivers for a son with significant disabilities could lead to caregiver burnout, resentment, and in extreme cases, thoughts of ending the burden. This doesn't prove anything, but it establishes possible motive. Evidence point number 10, forensic findings undisclosed. Police have never publicly revealed everything they found during the 2020 search of the Clark home. The fact they arrested Charles and Doris shortly after suggests they found something, perhaps evidence that had been hidden or overlooked in 1993, or perhaps chemical traces that modern forensic techniques could detect. Whatever they found wasn't enough to charge the Clarks, but it was enough to justify the arrests. Here's what's important to understand. Police and prosecutors likely believe Charles and Doris were involved in Stephen's disappearance. But belief and proof are different things. Without Stephen's body, without physical evidence of a crime, without a confession, prosecutors can't prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence against the Clarks is entirely circumstantial. Inconsistent statements, a missing witness, suspicious behavior, possible motive. In criminal law, circumstantial evidence can be powerful. People have been convicted on it. But in this case, it wasn't strong enough. From the Clarks' perspective, and from the perspective of those who believe in their innocence. Memory inconsistencies are normal after 28 years. The witness probably existed, but had no reason to follow the case. The medication issue was just poor memory/organization. Nobody saw Stephen because it was December and the seafront was nearly empty. The delayed report was simply confused parents hoping for the best. Charles's public presence showed dedication, not deception. There's no actual evidence of a crime. Both interpretations of the evidence are possible. That's why this case is so frustrating and so controversial. After 32 years, multiple theories exist about what happened to Stephen Clark. Let's examine each one thoroughly, considering all the evidence. Theory number 1. The parents did it. The police theory. Something happened to Stephen before December 28, 1992, possibly days or even weeks before. Perhaps he became seriously ill due to missing his medication. Perhaps there was an accident at home. Perhaps, in a moment of desperation and burnout, Charles and Doris harmed him. They then hid or disposed of his body, possibly buried locally, possibly taken out to sea, possibly destroyed in some way we can't imagine. On December 28th, Doris went to Saltburn alone and created the story about the public toilets to establish a public place where Stephen could disappear. She then came home, and they reported him missing, beginning a 28-year charade of searching for a son they knew was dead. Evidence supporting this. All the inconsistencies in Doris's account. The phantom witness. No confirmed sightings of Stephen. The medication issues. Suspicious timing of the report. Forensic findings in 2020 undisclosed. Evidence against this. No body has ever been found. No physical evidence of crime. No witnesses to anything suspicious. Seems psychologically extreme. Charles and Doris maintained innocence until their deaths. Probability. Medium high. This is what police believe, but can't prove. Theory number 2. Stephen was abducted. Stephen did go to Saltburn with Doris. He went into the public toilets. While in there, or immediately after leaving, he was approached by someone, perhaps someone who'd been watching him, someone who saw a vulnerable person alone. This person either forced Stephen into a vehicle or lured him away with false promises of help or friendship. Stephen was taken somewhere, possibly assaulted, killed, and his body hidden. The perpetrator got away with it because the timing, right before New Year's, in a quiet seaside town, meant few people were around to witness anything. Evidence supporting this would explain the complete disappearance. Predators do target vulnerable people. No evidence of family involvement beyond suspicions. Bodies can remain hidden for decades. Evidence against this. Stephen's mobility issues would make abduction difficult without causing a scene. No suspicious vehicles reported. No similar crimes in the area before or since. Stephen's cautious nature would make him wary of strangers. Predators usually leave some trace evidence. Probability. Low-medium, possible, but less likely given the lack of any evidence. Theory number 3. Stephen had an accident. Stephen left the toilets and, for reasons unknown, wandered toward the cliffs or beach. He was familiar with the area, but perhaps became disoriented. He fell from a cliff, or went into the water, or had some other accident. His body was swept out to sea or hidden in rock crevices, never to be recovered. Evidence supporting this. Saltburn's cliffs are dangerous. Bodies lost at sea may never be found. Winter conditions make accidents more likely. Would explain lack of evidence. Evidence against this. Stephen was cautious and familiar with the area. Search dogs found no trace of him beyond the toilets. No personal items were ever found. His mobility issues would make it unlikely he'd wander far from where his mother was waiting. Probability. Low. Would require multiple unlikely things to happen. Theory number 4. Stephen disappeared voluntarily. Stephen had been planning to leave. Maybe he'd been in contact with someone, a friend, a support organization, someone he'd met. On December 28th, that person was waiting near the toilets. Stephen went in, met them out back or through a different exit, and left to start a new life. He's been living anonymously for 32 years, perhaps with a new identity, perhaps abroad, perhaps supported by someone who helped him escape. Evidence supporting this would explain the complete disappearance. Some people do successfully vanish. Stephen might have wanted escape from his circumstances. Evidence against this. Stephen had no money. His physical disabilities would make independent living very difficult. He had no passport with him. No activity on his identity since 1992. His personality made planning elaborate disappearance unlikely. How would he support himself for 32 years? Probability, very low, nearly impossible given Stephen's circumstances. Theory number 5. The hybrid theory. Doris knows more. The scenario. This theory suggests something in between the official story and the police theory. Perhaps Stephen did go to Saltburn. Perhaps something happened there. He met someone, he went somewhere with someone, something occurred that Doris witnessed or knows about. But for reasons we don't understand, fear, shame, protection of Stephen or someone else, she hasn't told the full truth. Her story about the toilets is partially true, but with crucial details changed or omitted. Evidence supporting this explains the inconsistencies without requiring belief in murder. Accounts for Stephen's disappearance. Explains why Doris seems nervous in interviews. Evidence against this. Why would Doris hide information about Stephen's disappearance? If she witnessed an abduction, why not tell police? This theory requires believing something specific happened that we have no evidence for. Probability. Low. Too speculative without supporting evidence. Theory number 6. Accidental death cover-up. Stephen died accidentally at home. Perhaps a fall, a medical emergency, something sudden and tragic. Charles and Doris panicked. Instead of calling for help, they worried they'd be blamed for negligence, not giving him his medication properly, not supervising him adequately. In panic, they disposed of his body and created the Saltburn story to avoid investigation into what happened at home. Evidence supporting this would explain lack of evidence at the Saltburn location, explains the parents' behavior, less psychologically extreme than believing they murdered him, explains the timeline inconsistencies. Evidence against this still requires belief that parents covered up son's death for 32 years. No evidence of an accident at home. Most people would call ambulance, even if panicked. Probability. Medium, more psychologically plausible than murder, but still unproven. The frustrating truth is that without Stephen's body, without new evidence, without a confession, we may never know which theory is correct. What we do know: Stephen Clark vanished on December 28, 1992. The official story has significant problems. Police believe his parents were involved. No charges could be brought due to lack of evidence. Stephen has never been found. The case remains open. The mystery remains unsolved. The arrests in September 2020 marked a turning point, not just in the investigation, but in how the Clark family would be viewed forever. After being released without charge in December 2020, Charles Clark returned to his home, but life would never be normal again. The media attention was intense. Reporters camped outside the house. Neighbors who'd known him for decades now looked at him differently. The man who'd been seen as a tragic figure, a father endlessly searching for his son, was now viewed by many as a potential murderer who'd gotten away with it. Charles gave no interviews after his release. His lawyer released statements maintaining his innocence, but Charles himself remained silent. His health was declining. He was in his 80s, and the stress of the arrest and investigation had taken its toll. On date 2021, Charles Clark died at age 82. He died in his home, with Doris by his side. His death meant that even if new evidence emerged proving he'd been involved in Stephen's disappearance, he could never be prosecuted. Justice, if it was owed, would never be served against him. Local newspapers ran obituaries. Some focused on his decades of searching for Stephen. Others noted the cloud of suspicion he died under. Charles Clark's legacy was forever complicated. Doris Clark, now in her mid-80s as of 2025, still lives in the Marski area. She has never been charged with any crime. She has never confessed to any involvement in Stephen's disappearance. But she lives under a cloud of permanent suspicion. Even though no charges were brought, even though the Crown Prosecution Service determined there wasn't enough evidence, the arrest changed everything. Former friends avoid her. Neighbors who once sympathized now wonder what really happened. Her life has become one of isolation and suspicion. Through her lawyer, Doris has maintained that she had nothing to do with Stephen's disappearance, that police got it wrong, and that the real answers about what happened to her son remain unknown. She rarely appears in public. She doesn't give interviews. She lives quietly, perhaps waiting for death to finally end the nightmare her life has become, whether that nightmare is the loss of an innocent son or the burden of a terrible secret. The Stephen Clark case raises several important legal questions. Question 1. Can you arrest someone without evidence? The arrests of Charles and Doris were controversial. Critics argued that police arrested an elderly couple without sufficient evidence, causing trauma and public humiliation, only to release them without charges. Police defenders argue that arrests are part of the investigative process. Sometimes arrests are necessary to conduct formal interviews under caution, to execute search warrants, and to move an investigation forward. The legal threshold for arrest is lower than the threshold for charging someone. Police need reasonable suspicion to arrest. Prosecutors need realistic prospect of conviction to charge. The Clark arrests were legal, but were they ethical? Opinions remain divided. Question 2. Double jeopardy. Can Doris be tried if new evidence emerges? If Stephen's body is found tomorrow, if a deathbed confession emerges, if new forensic evidence is discovered, can Doris still be prosecuted? The answer is yes. Double jeopardy. The principle that you can't be tried twice for the same crime only applies if you've been acquitted at trial. Doris was never charged, never tried, never acquitted. If sufficient evidence emerges, she can still be prosecuted. This means the case against her remains technically open, and she lives with the possibility that one day, police might knock on her door again. Question 3. What about civil proceedings? In some cases, families of victims can bring civil lawsuits even when criminal prosecution fails. Could Stephen's extended family sue Charles and Doris's estate? The complication is that Stephen is the victim, and without a body, without proof of death, without legal declaration of how he died, civil proceedings would face enormous challenges. Additionally, who would bring such a suit? Stephen's parents were the people accused. Extended family members might not have legal standing. The investigation status. Cleveland police have stated that Stephen Clark's case remains an open investigation. This means, if new information emerges, they will investigate. If anyone comes forward with evidence, they will act. The file is never closed, never forgotten. But practically speaking, without new evidence, there's nowhere for the investigation to go. Police have pursued their primary theory, that the parents were involved, as far as they can without evidence to support charges. Unless Stephen's body is found, unless someone confesses, unless new witnesses emerge, the case will remain in limbo indefinitely. The arrests and subsequent release without charges divided Marski and Saltburn into roughly 3 camps. Camp 1. The Clarks are innocent. These people believe police got it wrong. They think Charles and Doris were grieving parents who were traumatized by false accusations. They point to the lack of charges as proof the police had nothing. Camp 2. The Clarks are guilty. These people believe police were right, but couldn't prove it. They think the evidence points clearly to Charles and Doris being involved, and the failure to charge them was due to lack of physical evidence, not lack of guilt. Camp 3. We'll never know. These people acknowledge the case is complex. They see problems with Doris's story, but also recognize that suspicion isn't proof. They've accepted that the truth may never be known. The divisions created by this case may never heal. Families who were once friends stopped speaking. The case became a litmus test for how people view evidence, justice, and reasonable doubt. Stephen's case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube videos. Each covers the same facts, but reaches different conclusions depending on the creator's perspective. Some present the case as elderly parents falsely accused. Others present it as parents who got away with murder. Most acknowledge the truth is murky. The public's fascination with the case continues because it embodies a fundamental question. How much can we trust the people closest to us? Criminal psychologists who've reviewed the case note several concerning elements. The performative nature of Charles's public appeals. The inconsistencies in Doris's accounts. The phenomenon of familial homicide, where caregivers reach breaking points. Statistical data showing family members are often responsible in missing persons cases. But they also acknowledge, no psychological profile can prove guilt. Grief can appear performative without being fake. Memory is fallible. Statistics aren't evidence in individual cases. Forensic experts note, without a body, proving murder is nearly impossible. Modern techniques can find evidence decades old, but only if there's something to find. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Legal experts observe, the prosecution was right not to charge without sufficient evidence. A failed prosecution would have meant double jeopardy, preventing future charges if evidence emerged. Better to keep the case open than to charge and lose. As we approach 33 years since Stephen's disappearance, certain questions haunt everyone who studies this case. 1. If Stephen died at home, where's his body? 2. If Doris's story is true, where did Stephen go after leaving the toilets? 3. Why has no one ever found any trace of him? No remains, no clothing, no belongings? 4. If the parents were involved, how did they dispose of a body without being seen? 5. Can two ordinary people really keep such a dark secret for 3 decades? 6. Why did police wait 28 years to act on their suspicions? 7. Will we ever know the truth? Perhaps the saddest part of this case is that Stephen himself has been lost in the controversy. Stephen wasn't a case file or a mystery or a debate topic. He was a real person, a 23-year-old man with hopes, fears, joys, and struggles. A son, whether his parents loved him or harmed him. A human being who deserved better than to vanish without a trace. Whatever happened on December 28, 1992, Stephen Clark deserved to be found. He deserved answers. He deserved justice. And 32 years later, he still hasn't received any of those things. So where does this leave us? After examining every detail, every piece of evidence, every theory, what can we conclude about the disappearance of Stephen Clark? Let me be crystal clear about the facts that are not in dispute. 1. Stephen Clark existed. He was a real person with a real life. 2. On December 28, 1992, Stephen was reported missing by his parents from Saltburn-by-the-Sea. 3. Despite extensive searches, Stephen was never found. No body, no remains, no trace. 4. Doris Clark's account of what happened has inconsistencies and problematic elements. 5. The mysterious witness who allegedly checked the toilets was never identified. 6. In 2020, police arrested Charles and Doris on suspicion of murder. 7. No charges were brought due to insufficient evidence. 8. Charles died in 2021. Doris remains alive as of 2025. 9. The case remains officially unsolved and open. These are facts. Everything else is interpretation, theory, and speculation. I need to be honest with you. After researching this case extensively, reviewing all available evidence, and examining the timeline carefully, I find Doris's account highly problematic. The inconsistencies are troubling. The missing witness is suspicious. The delayed reporting is concerning. The lack of any confirmed sighting of Stephen is significant. Does this mean I believe Charles and Doris murdered their son? I can't say that definitively because I don't have proof. But I do believe there's more to this story than what the official account tells us. I think something happened to Stephen that his parents know about, whether that's an accident they covered up, a moment of desperation that went too far, or a terrible secret they've kept for 3 decades. But belief isn't evidence. Suspicion isn't proof. And in our justice system, people are innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The police couldn't prove their case. That means legally, Charles and Doris must be considered innocent. Morally and ethically, each person must decide what they believe based on the evidence presented. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, several things could have changed the outcome of this case. 1. Immediate thorough investigation. In 1992, police should have been more skeptical of Doris's account from the beginning. The inconsistencies were there from day one. 2. Forensic examination. The Clark home should have been forensically examined more thoroughly in 1992 when evidence would have been fresher. 3. Witness appeals. More aggressive witness appeals in the immediate aftermath might have found people who saw, or didn't see, Stephen in Saltburn. 4. Psychological evaluation. Doris and Charles should have been evaluated by forensic psychologists early in the investigation. 5. Financial investigation. A deep dive into the family's financial situation might have revealed motive. But 1992 was a different era in policing. Forensic techniques were less advanced. Missing persons investigations were less sophisticated. And nobody wanted to believe parents could harm their disabled son. Stephen Clark's disappearance teaches us several important lessons. Lesson 1. Question everything. Even the most seemingly devoted parents can harbor dark secrets. Decades of public grief don't prove innocence. Lesson 2. Inconsistencies matter. Small discrepancies in stories can be signs of larger deceptions. Investigators must pay attention to details. Lesson 3. The power of time. The longer a case goes unsolved, the harder it becomes to solve. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Justice delayed can become justice denied. Lesson 4. Justice without closure. Sometimes we have to accept that we'll never know the full truth. This is deeply unsatisfying, but it's reality. Lesson 5. The importance of evidence. Suspicion, no matter how strong, cannot replace physical evidence. Without a body, without forensics, without witnesses, even a most likely theory remains just that, a theory. Where do we go from here? The Stephen Clark case will likely never be definitively solved unless 1. Stephen's body is discovered. 2. Someone confesses, Doris, or someone else with knowledge. 3. New forensic evidence emerges. 4. A witness comes forward with crucial information. The chances of any of these happening decrease with each passing year. But hope remains. Cold cases have been solved after 30, 40, even 50 years. Deathbed confessions happen. Bodies are found during construction projects. Witnesses overcome fear and come forward. It's possible that one day we'll know the truth about what happened to Stephen Clark. If you lived in Marski or Saltburn in December 1992, if you were in the area on December 28th, if you have any information, no matter how insignificant it seems, please contact Cleveland Police. Even the smallest detail could be the piece that finally solves this mystery. Stephen deserves to be found. His story deserves an ending. And the truth, whatever it is, deserves to come out. The disappearance of Stephen Clark is a tragedy wrapped in mystery, surrounded by suspicion, and buried under decades of unanswered questions. Whether Stephen was the victim of his parents' desperation, a random predator's evil, a terrible accident, or something we haven't even considered, he was a victim. A life cut short. A person lost. For 32 years, Stephen has been missing. For 32 years, someone has known the truth. For 32 years, that truth has remained hidden. Maybe it will remain hidden forever. Maybe justice will never be served. Maybe we'll never know what really happened on December 28th, 1992. But we can do one thing. We can remember Stephen Clark. We can refuse to let his case be forgotten. We can keep asking questions, seeking answers, and demanding that the truth, whatever it is, eventually comes to light. Because that's what Stephen deserves. That's what every missing person deserves. And that's why cases like this matter, even when they seem impossible to solve. What do you think? I've laid out all the evidence. I've presented all the theories. I've given you all the facts that are available. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Charles and Doris Clark were involved in Stephen's disappearance? Or do you think something else happened that day in Saltburn? Do you think police were right to arrest them? Or was it an overstep based on suspicion rather than evidence? What do you think happened to Stephen Clark? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. This case involves real people, a real young man who vanished, and real parents who either lost their son tragically or hid a terrible crime. Whichever you believe, approach it with empathy and thoughtfulness. If this deep dive into Stephen Clark's case resonated with you, please subscribe to the Vanished Files. We investigate the cases that time forgot, the mysteries that remain unsolved, and the people who deserve to be remembered. Hit the like button if you want to see more cases like this. Share this video to keep Stephen's case in the public eye. You never know who might see it and remember something crucial. In our next video, we'll examine another disappearance that defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about missing persons cases. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, stay compassionate, and never forget that behind every unsolved mystery is a real person who deserves answers. This has been the Vanished Files. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.